welcome you once again for this session. This session is essentially to release a very recent report brought out by NAS following a Indo-U.S. workshop held here nearly a year before on the technical aspects of civilian nuclear material security. I don't have to say anything on why this particular topic was chosen at that time and what are the various issues which were discussed, but it's clear that this problem is multidisciplinary. It is not one aspect. There are multiple aspects to it, and you need to address the various issues connected with material security, starting from material accounting to the people who are concerned, who are operating, who are working in those establishments, how to handle those people. So it's very specific but multidimensional problem. And I'm very glad that NAS has chosen to bring out a book capturing the various discussions which took place last year, and I'm sure it will set the tone for further action. What could be done if the problems are identified? What can we do to identify solutions? I am going to request Dr. Grover from the Department of Atomic Energy to release these books formally today. I don't have to say much of an introduction to Grover. He is very well known. He has been very actively involved in the Indo-U.S. dialogue right from the beginning of the dialogue on civilian nuclear agreement between the two countries. And maybe you should release the book and then say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Ramurthy, for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come to this place. The issue of nuclear security has several dimensions. We talk about security of nuclear material, security of facilities, export controls, security of technologies, and development of technologies that are proliferation resistant. And each of these dimensions needs to be examined from an applicable perspective. And what was examined here 1.5 years back was technical aspects of nuclear material security. Here one notes that by using science and technology, one can reduce the magnitude of this problem of the security of nuclear materials. This issue of nuclear security has come into a sharper focus because of nuclear security summits, the first one in Washington in 2010, then in Seoul 2012, and the next will be in The Hague in the month of March, just towards the end of March. And during these summits, discussions have taken place on all aspects of nuclear security, including global nuclear security architecture, role of International Atomic Energy Agency, security of nuclear materials and radioactive sources, nexus between nuclear security and nuclear safety, security during transportation, combating illicit trafficking, nuclear forensics, information security, and most important, nuclear security culture in organizations, particularly industry. India has participated in the previous two summits at the highest level. Prime Minister of India led the delegation, and the preparations are on for participation in the next summit as well. Now, what is happening is that as a part of this summit process, groups of nations have come out with the gift baskets. I do not know how many of you are aware of it. They have tried to, along the previous two summits issued communiques, and Washington summit also issued a work plan, and then idea of gift baskets where individual countries come together and try to say something more than that, more than what is there in the communique. And all of you also perhaps know that one organization has come out with the Nuclear Security Index, and the way this index is organized, one gets a sense that sorry for this. But different people are looking at this summit process in a slightly different way. From the gift baskets and the way this articulation has been going on, some are looking at it to promote disarmament and elimination of weapon-grade material itself, but nuclear security is nuclear security to mix up with other issues for which there are different forums creates a totally different dynamic. And the way some people look at it, one see an element of what one can call as a confirmation bias. One does see an element of that in the way nuclear security index has been compiled. But all I will like to say here is that this nuclear security has to be looked at nuclear security without any confirmation bias, and one has to look at the synergy between security and science and technology to reduce the requirement of nuclear security, to reduce the salience of this problem, so as to ensure that nuclear materials can be used for generation of electricity, which is the need for all the countries, and it is particularly so for India, where we are looking at large requirements of energy in the coming period. Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe we can have some overview of the summary of India-US workshop on technical aspects of nuclear material security. First, Dr. L.V. Krishnan.
Thank you, Grover. It seems to me that you can do an overview if you have some familiarity with the subject, or by attempting an overview, you can try to gain some familiarity with the subject. I don't know what fits me. Either way, I think I would like to thank Director Niaz and Lalita for this opportunity given to me. Now, the workshop on nuclear security that we had last year provided a wealth of information, just as this workshop is also generating. But that was on a specific type of installations and materials. It was an excellent opportunity for professionals to interact, exchange their experiences, perspectives, and programs. I'm not going to be able to cover all that was discussed, but we'll focus on nuclear material control and accounting, physical security, cyber security, and nuclear forensics, the topics that were mentioned earlier. Speakers for the workshop came from the US with extensive experience in diverse aspects of nuclear security. Their experience resulted from production, processing, and handling of nuclear materials in the US on a large scale. It called for development of advanced materials control and accounting techniques and training of large numbers of personnel. Though production of nuclear materials in the US has now stopped, there remain large holdings to be secured. The group from India, however, was marked by comparatively less experience, working with little opportunity to interact with peers elsewhere. The group has had to develop instrumentation and technology in-house, as was explained during the workshop, and to exercise great care in securing and making effective use of the limited quantities of nuclear materials available. Now, the electricity generation program of India, based on nuclear power, means continuing production of nuclear materials. Proliferation resistant reactor systems are being adopted, and also reprocessing techniques, even as security for nuclear material is being strengthened. I noticed that the workshop had the focus on nuclear materials, which are, however, better secured. The radiological materials are more widely distributed, less well secured, and present no mean risks, whether by accident or malicious use. I think they deserve a workshop by themselves. Now, in the workshop, the link between security, safety, and safeguards was recognized, and that a proper balance must be found between the conflicting needs of transparency that is essential for safety and confidentiality for security. Now, in India's closed nuclear power program, closed cycle nuclear power program, good practices in all these three areas would also yield dividend in terms of efficient and successful plant operation, and I think that must not be forgotten. Now, let's look at the nuclear materials control and accounting. The need is there for the right type of nuclear instrumentation for detection, identification, and quantification of nuclear materials. Now, non-destructive assay is the ideal technique. With gamma ray spectrometry or neutron detectors, it can yield quick results. There was also reference in the workshop to near real-time measurements during the processing of nuclear materials. Some of them involve a large network of suitable neutron detectors. India is well aware of the challenges in design and manufacture of such instruments. Now, in any process, unavoidably, some material is left over in the plant equipment. The quantity recovered from the various processes in the plant is not the same as what enters. This deficit goes by the description material unaccounted for, or MUF. If it is allowed to accumulate, it raises concern about accidental criticality in the plant besides fears about diversion. Now, the near real-time accounting techniques help perform material balance in the process areas very frequently to get a better picture of the MUF and also take measures to minimize it. Now, let's come to physical security. Physical protection technologies for intrusion monitoring at the facility perimeter, video analytics for detection of the intruder, access control for entry into plant areas, all these were discussed. Now, every nuclear facility, even in the case of reactors of the same design, is complex and unique. Developing a design-based threat for each facility according to the nature and quantity of nuclear materials handled, as well as vulnerability analysis for the plant were considered. Now, the formulation of the design-based threat requires some knowledge of the attractiveness of the nuclear material at various stages of the plant. Now it is considered best for scientists, security personnel, law enforcement authorities, and other specialists to work together in defining a design basis threat for the plant. Now the importance of periodic review of the design basis threat and upgrading of the vulnerability assessment, of course, has to be highlighted, and that was done. Now likewise, the importance of training of personnel at all levels with their varied responsibilities, inculcation of security culture that was mentioned among them, and periodic exercises to ensure their effective response was emphasized. Now India has established a global center for nuclear energy partnership. As a part of that, a school of nuclear security studies and also a school of radiological safety studies are being run. Training of personnel is a major objective in these schools, and the US also has committed to assist in these activities. Now the degree of threats from external sources for civilian nuclear materials varies from country to country, but insider threats of potential sabotage activity are common to all. Appropriately, it was pointed out while discussing systems approach for nuclear materials security that not just terrorist elements but also risks from activists and demonstrators must be taken into account. This morning we heard about how activists had got into the inner perimeter of a very secure site. Presently in India, there is much greater concern about terrorist elements than others, and more likely from the seaside. We have not had activists breaking into our sites so far, but we cannot rule it out. Now we come to forensics. It refers to the detailed examination to which a smuggled nuclear material is subjected after it is seized. Various analytical techniques are used to characterize its isotopic composition, presence of major elements as well as trace elements, its microstructure, morphology, and age. Only then an evaluation is possible. Although there is now capability to analyze samples with just a few thousand atoms of plutonium, nuclear forensics is still considered an inexact science. There is a reason for it. Even with such fine measurements, it's still difficult to reach final conclusions about the source of the seized material to meet legal requirements. Now, a database on nuclear materials that have undergone various levels of processing in the course of production is needed for comparison with the observed characteristics of the seized material. Now, compilation of a national database is the first step to verify the provenance of the seized material to check if it is of local origin. Now, several countries have set up a library of forensic data. The US has built up a database with 300 physical samples from around the world for just uranium ore concentrate and yellow cake. It has additional data for about 4,000 samples. India does not have access now to the very advanced techniques of measurement needed. Indigenous development is going on. Maybe it would take some time before we get there. Then we had also discussion on cyber security. Key elements like deter, detect, delay, deny, and respond are common to both physical and cyber security. A significant difference, however, is that attribution is very difficult in case of a cyber attack. Present-day instrumentation and control systems and plant network systems are computerized control systems. Software used must be tested from safety as well as security angles. New vulnerabilities appear all the time, calling for a dynamic mode in assessment of cyber security. Use of commercial off-the-shelf or COTS systems, both operating systems and hardware, has its advantages but warrants caution about the unknown and underutilized features in them which could be used by an attacker. Now, it was told that it uses a secure network assessment system, access system for nuclear facilities. It does not allow an outside system to be integrated into the network. Like in physical security, different zones are set up, separated by barriers or firewalls. The system monitors the network for any malicious behavior and if discovered, changes the firewall to isolate the culprit zone. The firewall log, of course, is not examined very frequently. An attack could still occur and not be promptly detected. Now, increasing use of digital systems in physical security programs means that they also have to be protected physically and also from cyber threats. The US is now testing a physical and cyber risk assessment tool called PackRat that monitors the physical as well as the cyber pathway to the site and to the program. Now, the regulatory guide of the US NRC on cyber security is very detailed, is about 130 pages long. Perhaps that is an example for us to draw lessons from. Now, the audience was also cautioned that lessons from nuclear security learned in one country cannot be directly translated to another without taking into account differences in culture and decision making. I think the factor of culture keeps coming up over and over again. Now, to conclude, I would say that there is a context for cooperation between the US and India in this area. The US attaches importance to international safeguards and security. India believes in recycling nuclear materials for power generation. But there is common ground here in the form of development and use of technology for tracking and recovering nuclear materials from all parts of a facility to minimize loss in any form and maximize safety and efficiency of their use. This also contributes to ensuring security. It's a form of domestic safeguards as well. The longer term objective of India for proliferation resistant fuel cycle also coincides with the US interest. Now, I have here a wish list of a few specific areas for cooperation. I'm sure Ronald will be also adding to that. What I would like to see would be cooperation in methods for accurate measurement of nuclear material in spent fuel from reactors to serve as a basis for determining shipper-receiver differences. Methods for online determination of nuclear material content in process solutions and glove boxes fairly accurately. These are important not just from security angle but also from the plant efficiency angle. Instrumentation for quantification of plutonium content in waste. And of course, overcoming vulnerabilities in the use of COTS in plant computer systems. And with respect to forensics, detection and age assessment of uranium and plutonium in environmental matrices and seized objects. And of course, last but not the least, human aspects of nuclear security, training and licensing issues for protective forces, and acculturation of all personnel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. So now we can have a summary from, okay, Mr. Raymond.
So recognizing that I am between you and the end of the day, I will try and be relatively brief and showing just a few slides that actually I can be brief for another reason, which is I think we have very good agreement in our overview of the workshop as well as looking forward to where we might go. As soon as the slides come up, I will show you just a few slides to summarize some of these points. Again, I promise just a few slides. It's a little bit dark. Oh, I can tell already this is going to have an effect. Okay, so let me move right along. Quick, for those of you who aren't there, this is the title of the workshop. You've already heard it. The focus was on civilian nuclear material security on the one hand, and on the other hand, the focus was also on technical aspects. And that's because we largely come from a technical community in the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and we brought several technical experts from the U.S. to meet with technical experts here in India. You've already heard about the background, which is encapsulated here. It came from the Nuclear Security Summit, of which now there have been a few, and there's one more upcoming shortly. One of the key points I wanted to emphasize was one of the outcomes of the 2010 Nuclear Security Summit was the commitment on the part of the government of India to establish a global center for nuclear energy partnership, and Dr. Grover has had a key role in making this a reality, and so I wanted to acknowledge this because I felt in his modesty he had kind of skipped over this a little bit. I do want to make a few comments about civilian nuclear materials. Now, many of you are experts, so I don't want to belabor these points, but the fact is that what we talk about as an issue of interest for the United States and for India is, of course, of much broader interest because nuclear materials are found in many countries around the world. And in fact, the tracking of nuclear materials, including civilian nuclear materials in particular, is less perfect than we would like. I won't go through all of these bullets in detail, but there's clearly a need for balance between public concerns about nuclear energy, nuclear power on the one hand, those concerns balanced off against what is the real need for greater electrical capacity. And in particular, what was commented on earlier here in India, the prospect for growth is enormous. And so there's a huge pressure, political and technical pressure to enhance electrical power generation. And of course, in all of this comes the mix of events, historic events like the Fukushima disaster. I won't go any further on this, but I do want to give you a quick summary of the chapters in the book for those of you who haven't seen it. We had touched on, and again, most of these have been mentioned. We gave an overview, as I've just given you now a quick review of, but the systems approach was featured very much in the workshop. Systems approach to security at civilian nuclear facilities, as well as overall in the strategies that are used. Physical security, cybersecurity, a focus on people, and the comment about insider threat. I'll come back to that in a few moments. We had a very important session on nuclear forensics. We just heard a few words about that. And again, I want to emphasize the second to last bullet. This is a reality that nuclear energy is a growth industry for the foreseeable future. And very much this is a pressure that's felt here in India. What we meant by a systems approach is elaborated a little bit on this slide. Which is that, first of all, we recognize that the issues are not unique to one country. We need to compare notes, and we're starting in our discussions through this particular dialogue with a bilateral discussion between the U.S. and India, but of course we expect on the U.S. end to be talking with many countries, which we are doing, and of course our Indian friends and colleagues doing the same. Communication with the public, this was mentioned earlier, communication with the public is absolutely crucial. And the point was made by many that thinking through those communications before there's an accident or a disaster, this is what's really essential. In particular, for those of us in the technical community, we have to remember that it's not enough to have a technical solution to a problem. We don't always have those solutions, but when we do have those solutions, that may not be enough because we have to go the extra step to convince the public at large and indeed policymakers as well that those solutions are reliable and they can be implemented. Finally, there was discussion during the workshop of the balance, if you want, the tension between the research interests in the technical community versus the security interests also shared by the technical community, but that have broader implications for the public at large. And that balance is sometimes hard to maintain. So that's a quick, and I have to admit, somewhat selective, you might say biased, summary of some points of the workshop. And what I wanted to do now is effectively, I have one slide that I'm going to build up with a little bit of a digression for just a moment that looks towards the future. And in fact, again, we've heard some of these themes, but looking to some of the specific areas in which we could further collaborate. And again, the focus is on technologies. And here the first one I wanted to mention is, in a sense, the most simple-minded. Detector systems. When technical people get together, we tend always to think about better widgets and better detectors, in particular in this arena. But what I want to emphasize is the fundamental detectors, in particular for radiation detection. That technology has not changed significantly in not just years, but in decades. So that's not really where the developments will have great value added as we foresee them. Rather, it's in the larger scale system integration. And what we mean by that, for example, are user-friendly systems with built-in training and validation. So these are systems that are intended to mitigate the problem that we heard about earlier today of an intelligent person being tasked with an extremely boring, a lengthy task every day. That's a recipe for disaster. And you have to build into the system certain challenges and tasks that could be part of an ongoing training that actually keeps the individual alert and keeps them notified that they are actually performing at a certain level, and there are metrics that can come out of this. This means integrating the hardware that we so love as technologists, software we also know something about, but an area that we feel much less comfortable about, because frankly we know much less about that, is psychology, is the individual and the social psychology, sometimes referred to as the culture that's involved. And this is a very imperfect area on which I think we can benefit from comparing notes across communities. We've already heard about nuclear forensics, a rather arcane, specialized area of chemistry. We heard about some of the opportunities that are available, and I want to reiterate those with one slide, which is a bit of a digression, but it highlights some key points that were made during one of our important sessions during the workshop. There are very strong capabilities in nuclear forensics, but the interpretation is still, to some degree, a matter of art form. More important than that, the comment that was just made, it's not enough just to have a detailed compositional, isotopic, physical characterization of a sample, but to go the next step towards attribution, towards actionable intelligence, as I guess some would put it. That is a very difficult prospect, and all the more so that depending on the nature of the catastrophe, there may be enormous pressures to have results, actionable results, in a very short time scale. So these are areas where I think there are important developments that can be made in technology. Just as an example, the ability to start analyzing a sample in the field rather than having to collect samples and then bring them to some specialized high-tech clean room type of super laboratory. Databases were mentioned, and there was quite a bit of a discussion about databases, because you can have the analysis, but if you don't have anything to compare against, then the analyses are not very useful for attribution. So a couple of other comments along these lines, more specific understanding of the way that we can characterize the processing that materials have gone through. And again, we heard mention of this a few moments ago, processes that were involved, and the timing, that is the chronometry, the age dating of those processes. And we believe that an effective program will require international cooperation. So I've summarized this as my second bullet here of nuclear forensics. Actually, let me see if I can, okay. Nuclear forensics with chronometry refers to the ability to actually date when certain processes took place in the handling of the sample, in the processing of the sample over time. And then the databases was a point of discussion. There is a technical end to this, and of course a political end as well. The technical end is that the databases need to be put together. Various countries, various international organizations have certain kinds of databases available mostly to themselves or to select members, but making the databases more broadly available is something that I think has some potential technological solutions. So there's mention here of appropriate search engines. That's code language for search engines that might involve, for example, privacy protecting querying. In other words, I might not have to reveal to you how I have come to the conclusion that the sample that whose composition you're entering into my database, I'm either going to warn you is a problematic sample or reassure you that it is not a problematic sample. I may not want to tell you exactly why I think that, but that may be useful information for your doing subsequent studies, or the other way around. Perhaps I'm using your database and you don't want to tell me the details of exactly what's in the database or how you come to a certain kind of technical judgment, but there are means of actually allowing me to query a database without revealing those kinds of details. Now, on top of this technical challenge that is in the arena of kind of a cybersecurity and a privacy protection, there's of course the very important political backdrop, and it's very difficult to move forward on sharing the databases without having more discussion at the policy level. We hope that by establishing some level of trust and confidence among the technical communities that we can help move the political and policy communities forward in an appropriate manner. Already up on the slide is my second to last bullet, the insider threat. I put it up there simply for completeness. We all recognize that this is a huge issue, but quite frankly, we have very few good ideas, in my opinion. The research on how to mitigate the insider threat, that is how to identify the insider, what to do about it, that research is still, in my opinion, in infancy. When I mean research, I mean looking for technological solutions. Yes, there are personnel reliability programs. There are attempts using psychological assays and tests that are quite useful in their own right. I don't mean to minimize their impact, but I think there are also technological solutions that could be further developed and have not been thought about as much as they might be. So that's what I mean by the mitigation technology systems. These could be developed. We can talk about those some more. These are areas, I think, with considerable opportunity for collaboration. My final bullet is again inevitable, and that's cybersecurity. We're going to hear more about that. This subject tomorrow. We had some excellent experts at the workshop. We have some excellent experts here. We all recognize the importance of cybersecurity. I put it up to acknowledge this is again an area of huge opportunity for future collaboration, or potential for collaboration between technical experts in India and in the United States. And so with that, really, I wanted to lead to one final statement, if you want, a real summary from my point of view. And again, this is a bias, I admit, a biased overview, but the key to this whole conference was highlighting the potential for collaboration between our expert communities. We had members of our national laboratories, of some of our academic laboratories, colleagues who had cycled through, spent some time in industry. On the Indian side, similarly, there were experts from government laboratories, from academia, from industry, and it was, I think, very clear that the technical communities were at the time and continue to be anxious to collaborate with each other and compare notes. We could see many ways, many opportunities for us to benefit from each other's experiences and background, technical input. In some areas, one community, one side has a bit more expertise than the other. We can benefit from this. And so I've just highlighted with these 4 bullets some ideas that had come out of the workshop as a starting point for collaboration between our communities. But it's really this very last point, that's why I put it in red, that came across loud and clear in the workshop, namely to get the expert technical communities to be able to work with each other more effectively. And that, I think, is more a matter of policy decision than that the technical communities have anything but complete interest and enthusiasm for getting going in this direction. With that, I'll stop and take any questions along with our moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think we have quite some time as compared to what has been budgeted here. 6:45 is that. So any questions from anyone? Yes.
My question is for Dr. Raymond. in threat assessment in your nuclear power plants, what are the points you consider for the information to be kept as classified or to be sent to the public domain? What are the factors you consider before putting any information on classified and
So I can give you a correct and, in my opinion, slightly glib answer, which is to a large degree, the decisions of what information is classified or not is predetermined and essentially I'll call it almost a legal definition. And so there are experts who can make that judgment based on pre-existing criteria. But I don't think that's exactly a useful answer. And instead, I would actually turn to, there are a few colleagues here who know much more about this than I do, either as operational individuals or as people who have to actually work with facility security. And so I would actually like to turn the question over to one or another of my distinguished colleagues around the room who have first-hand experience, who can go beyond giving kind of the textbook official answer, but can tell you more of the realities. Are you willing to? Yeah, please.
Well, it comes as no surprise that when you analyze the security facility, you're going to identify all the protection strategies and systems that are deployed in this defense and find vulnerabilities and how to protect against those vulnerabilities being exploited. So generally these documents are reasonable to the public. They can be some overviews can be released, but the details of the analysis are
I just wanted to know what are the factors you take into consideration while putting some information in the classified basket? Because such assessments are done in food industry by FDA2, and FDA2 has put some information as classified. They are not sharing with even the technologists, even in the very close group. They usually keep mum on those information. I just wanted to know what are those factors that we should also take into consideration while asking questions that they might not be easy answering.
Well, we have classification guides that we follow when we write reports, and we have to classify the various sections, and that determines, what can be releasable and what's not. But in essence, it's description, details of protection system that someone could exploit if they were to know those. So that's pretty much the overall driver.
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Just wanted to state something. I agree that we need to look into how much danger is there from activists, but there is a slight difference. Oh, I thought I was quite loud. Yeah, I was saying, I do agree that there is a danger with activists, yes, but there is a slight difference. An activist can be one who is a responsible activist who is actually fighting against nuclear powers set up in the country. An activist could be one who is actually a saboteur behind the scene. So that there has to be a difference made between two. Secondly, sharing of nuclear material details. Every country has its own security reasons. They may not be sharing. However much they may want to share, however much there are considerations on the threats. Perhaps we have to go one step ahead and not just think about sharing of nuclear material details. We may have to think of cooperations on what if there is a threat which arises, and during the threat, how do you collaborate? Maybe that needs reasoning. Thirdly, on information. You're creating an information database. One has to be very clear and make sure there is no bias raised when there is an information database created, and how you actually interpret that information database. That has to be very carefully done.
If I've understood your question, I would like like to begin by recalling that there was a time when, sitting here in India, you could access reports of all the nuclear power stations in the US with details about the drawings of the layout, plant layout and all that. That I think should not be anymore published, and I think that has also been withdrawn. Okay. Otherwise, I think you could get it from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission because it had details about all the power plants. I think apparently from the security angle that cannot be made public. The other thing is that, as was mentioned, all the safety systems, which are the vulnerable components, if they are incapacitated, the plant could be affected. So I think those details cannot be. But what needs to be actually made available is, if the plant has a problem, I think the plant management must come out with the problem before the media comes out with it. I think that kind of a thing must be made available. And the radiation levels that are present around the plant, that must also be made available. This is not always being done in all the countries, but I think US and France are some of the countries which provide a good example of what is to be done in these cases. I think they are essential information to be made to the public.
And the discussion about the reliability of these plants and whether they're safe and whether they're properly regulated. So there are ways of sharing appropriate information and not sharing information that could lead to greater vulnerability and so on. Regarding the threat, which is what you talked about before, there's very little that's shared publicly. The design basis threat for facilities typically is not shared. And I wanted to speak just to one of the points that was made over here. There have been proposals for international databases that are all shared. In fact, what the United States has been proposing to other countries is that each country develop its own database, at least know what you have, and establish mechanisms for the data sharing that we were talking about, so that we don't run into this problem of, oh, we can't have something that's out there for everyone. But at least if someone asks you a question, be confident that you can answer it for your own purposes.
Let me add clarification here. Yeah. So you mentioned the design basis threat. There are some aspects of the design basis threat for our nuclear power plants that is released to the public. So do federal regulations. So as I mentioned, there's some high-level things that are releasable to the public in terms of security. So to give the public some assurance that appropriate measures are being put in place, but the specifics about security at an individual plant aren't.
Thank you, sir. I'm a retired nuclear submariner and a naval officer. My question is prompted by a couple of things that Dr. Raymond mentioned in his presentation. That was firstly about the insider threat, and secondly about the inadequacy of our current understanding or capability in the socio-psychological domain. And I relate this to an earlier reference to the same insider threat by a previous speaker in a different context, where he said that one of the measures against this was to keep a close observation of one's work personnel and look out for abnormalities in their behavior, conduct, attitudes, and so on. But I think there is a difficulty in this, and that is, if you take the certain number of these extreme cases that we have come across, very tragic, very unfortunate events that have happened, where you've had people running amok with guns and shooting up kids and so on, totally innocent bystanders. And in every single case, their neighbors have said, but he was perfectly normal. Their school teachers have said, but there was nothing wrong with him. And his friend said that he was such a good guy. So close observation may not reveal these lurking tendencies to do of resentment or whatever. I was wondering if we have, now I know that nuclear submariners, both in the US and in other countries, I myself have undergone such tests, pass periodically doing a written psychometric test. It's a pressure test, and which serves as an aid to psychological evaluation for stability in decision making, for confidence, for team qualities, and so on and so forth. All these things come out, and for any other paranoia that might exist. I'm wondering whether such an approach could help in the KYC requirement, and not KYC so much as to know your employee requirement. I was wondering whether that could be useful.
When I made reference to personnel reliability programs, that's very much the kind of, in detail, the kind of approach that's used. These kinds of tests that you are referring to, and a number of other evaluations. Some of them are just, if you want, common sense. For example, routine random testing for drugs and alcohol, which some people succumb to, and you would kind of think, oh, if someone's in a position of responsibility, whether a pilot of an aircraft or in charge of a submarine or some other critical facility, of course you want to know that they are actually physically functional. So yes, very much there are a number of these approaches that are used. I, again, don't want to demean their importance and their utility, but I think a renewed attempt at looking for what I would refer to as engineered solutions. So perhaps better examples were the ones that Mr. Augustine gave earlier today, where you have a system that requires two independent people to make, for instance, to take an action, since they independently have to confirm each other's actions. The so-called two-man rule is those kinds of approaches, and there are other kinds of engineered approaches that are intended to almost make it impossible, or it is very difficult to subvert the system if someone either basically goes crazy or has changed allegiances or aspirations. And this is an arena where I think we could benefit from, if you want, another round of investigation or again, technologies that are available for tracking what people are doing have greatly improved in a way that perhaps can, without minimizing their effectiveness and efficiency, might also be a way of essentially building into the system a difficulty for misusing the system, if I can put it that way. I don't know if you want to elaborate on this. You've thought a lot about this as well.
Well, at the workshop, one of the presentations was an overview of a 2-week training course that we had developed at the National Labs, which is being taught internationally. And it does identify an overall insider protection program. So we teach how to analyze against the insider. We look at material control processes, ways to identify anomalies, ways to engineer out the best you can an insider's opportunity. So that there are a lot of new developments in this area. My colleague Byron Gardner can elaborate as well. We used to teach insider as a small subset of the overall VA process. It's now blossomed into a whole 2-week course where we get into very fine detail of the operational aspects of the facility. But it's also an area that is ripe for collaboration as well. One thing we're also looking at incorporating into that process is the cyber aspect. So are there any electronic pathways that an insider could exploit, maybe in collaboration with an outsider? So there's lots of other things that could be added into the equation. There's a lot that exists right now, but I think there's still fruitful areas of collaboration for an insider.
Any other question? Yes, please.
I think you brought up a very good point in terms of social threats. I mean, one thing we have seen is, because you brought up school shootings, in every single aspect, the neighbors said they're fine kids, but their blogging behavior, their behavior in Second Life their behavior on social media was very different than what they were appearing normally. So that's after the fact, law enforcement was able to go back and trace back to their blogs what they were shopping, what they were doing online, showed completely radical behavior. So that's something a lot of companies do today in sensitive organizations. I mean, I will not name the organizations, but people related to the nuclear industry actually mine the social media to look for, are you disclosing where you're working? That itself poses a great threat because you can be persuaded to give that information out or where you're working and all that stuff. So there are training courses where industry is taking today to come train their employees, and they'll conduct live mining in front of the employees to show, hey, 15 of you in this room actually posted you're working for Uranco, and you said you are a nuclear engineer. Was it necessary to do that on the Facebook? And you even posted which plant you were in, what training you're doing. So those are simple things you could do, I mean, common sense things. Using cyber today, you don't have to be anywhere. You can just run a quick tool to say, I mean, it's not a threat. It's kind of like you're posting information that you're not supposed to. It's a clear violation of your policy. And the same thing you can convert back to look for insider threat. So just a few words on that.
Dr. Krishna.
Referring to the two-man rule, it's already being practiced in the nuclear power stations and plants handling nuclear materials in certain critical areas. But you can't extend it to all the various things which can lead to trivial incidents. But it is already being practiced.
Any other? Okay. Just one comment I will like to make, that I find there's a lot of tension at the present time. On the one side, civil society demanding transparency on every aspect. On the other hand, technologists and bureaucrats feeling the need to protect sensitive technologies. Now, how do we balance these two issues? Sensitive technologies, sensitive materials, they have to be protected, their locations have to be protected, but civil society is always insisting on transparency in every area. Any comment on this aspect? Yeah, please.
I think the problem is even a little bit bigger, because the counterpart to what you just said is also the tension between privacy and the kind of tracking that technology now inevitably makes possible. And to depersonalize the discussion, I would suggest that we all remind ourselves of how we are tracked and how we invite ourselves to be tracked by the private sector, by companies. And so I think there are both sides. There's both, as you say, this tension with transparency versus needing to protect certain kinds of sensitive, potentially harmful information or misusable information, but also the tracking of people. We heard of tracking of people on social media. Well, that's exactly what those social media companies are doing. That's their business model. On the one hand. On the other hand, I think, again, for our democracies, just as an example, in India and in the United States, there's quite a point of discussion these days about what is the nature of privacy. And for some, especially I find among technical colleagues, it's almost the easiest thing is to say privacy is gone. And perhaps that's so. I don't know that, but I think that's a little bit dangerous to jump to the conclusion that privacy is gone, because that has all sorts of other social and political consequences, I believe. So I think your question actually has both sides encapsulated, and I think this is very much an area of debate.
Yes.
Tiny cameras and even video cameras, and you have a person working in your home who is angry with you, and they leave cameras all over your home, then put them on the web. There's not much you can do about that. You can't get it back. And I asked him, how do you feel about that? And his answer was, he said, get used to it. And he walked away.
Well, yes, but you have something? No. Fine. So thank you. We had good discussion, and you want to say something? Okay. Thank you. So session is closed.